Hi, welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this episode, I am going to share with you my top 5 tips for beginners. Tip 1. Use a quality solid wood board. I know you don't want to ruin a board, but a quality solid wood board can be recycled, and I will show you how near the end of the video. Before we get to that, let me show you some examples of low-quality boards. I'm going to compare a wooden plaque I got at the craft store against a piece of basswood. Basswood is also called common linden. In this side-by-side shot, I'm burning patches of uniform color on both boards. The craft board is to the left of the black line and the basswood to the right. Notice how much smoother the burn strokes are on the basswood board. This is especially noticeable on the lighter burns. Despite being sanded, the craft board has pale vertical lines streaking through the burns. When I was using the circular motion burn stroke, I got results that were very similar to the previous example. The craft board, which is on the left side of the black line, has pale vertical lines appearing in the burn area. Next, I used the zigzag burn stroke. At first, I didn't notice much of a difference. When I increased the heat and started the next burn, it became harder to add layers of burn strokes on the craft board. The nib just wanted to follow in previous burn marks. It reminded me of how your tires can get stuck in a rut on a road. When I was burning at a fairly high heat, neither boards performed well, but I had more difficulty trying to control the nib direction on the craft board. Another common problem with poor quality boards is that they often lack uniform density. An example of that is this board someone gave me. It is a pretty board, but it's not good for pyrography. It has bands of really soft grain running through it, adjacent to bands of much firmer grain. When I burn over the softer areas, the wood darkens more than the adjacent wood. Plus, the pen tip has a tendency to sink into the softer areas. The sinking problem becomes worse the smaller the nib is. Some good options for wood are basswood boards and live edge planks. Also, aspen, poplar, and maple are good woods to burn on. Tip 1 Recap. Use a quality solid wood board because it will have uniform surface density, it will be easier to get smooth burn results, and it will be easier to layer burns. Tip 2. Prepare the board surface. At the very least, you should sand the surface of the board with 220 grit sandpaper. I personally use a 4-step process on all my boards. I'm going to show you that process and explain why I do it. So let's take a look. I've got this board divided into 3 sections. The left section will remain unsanded, so I covered it up. Then I sanded the middle and right sections with 220 grit sandpaper. I labeled the middle section as sanded and then covered it up, leaving only the right section exposed. With the right section, I misted it liberally with water and wiped off the excess and let it dry. Once dried, I removed the covering, and you can see that the middle section is the smoothest section on the board. Next, I resanded over the right section. This removes the nap that was raised up from the water. Now the right section is super smooth. I do the 4-step process: sand, wet, let dry, and sand again on all of my boards, including plywood. There are 3 major reasons for this. Reason 1. A smooth board allows the nib to glide over the wood surface. This makes it much easier to get consistent, repeatable burn results that are uniform in color. Reason 2. If I plan to add a liquid color like watercolors, the color doesn't bleed as much. Plus, it doesn't raise the nap, which would make the board feel fuzzy and rough. Reason 3. The 4-step process prevents the nap from raising during humidity changes. This is important for me because it can take me a number of months before I finish a project. My koala artwork took almost 2 years before I figured out a suitable fur texture. Tip 2 recap. Prepare the wood surface. Sand the board with 220 grit sandpaper. Wet the board. It should be damp but not soaking wet. Let the board dry and sand again. This removes surface imperfections that can snag the nib. It's easier to get smooth burn results. Humidity changes won't impact the board, and the board won't get fuzzy if you add liquid colorants like watercolors. Tip 3. Use a light hand pressure. Using a light hand pressure will prevent a number of problems from happening. I will show you a test that you can do to check your hand pressure, but first, let me show you why hand pressure matters. I'm using a light hand pressure as I burn a series of lines with a writer nib on basswood. Notice how uniform in color and width those lines are. Now I'm using a heavy hand pressure. The lines are no longer uniform in color, and the lines are much wider. Using the narrow edge of the writer nib reveals another problem: nib sinking. Smaller nibs have a tendency to sink into the wood. The smaller it is, the higher the tendency. The heavier the hand pressure is, the more the nib sinks into the wood surface, making it harder to control. As I angle the board, you can see how much deeper the nib sunk into the wood when I used a heavy hand pressure. Red arrows are pointing to the heavy hand pressure burns. I'm repeating the line demo on the low quality board to show how much deeper the pen tip sinks into the board. Red arrows are pointing to the lines burned using a heavy hand pressure. This shows the basswood on top and the low quality board on the bottom. A lot of the textures found in my artwork are created by layering burn strokes. I began by burning uniform strokes. Then I layered circular motion over the top of it. Since I'm using a light hand pressure, I didn't have any problems. I repeated the burn example, but this time using heavy hand pressure. Notice how quickly the color fades. Reburning over it doesn't add noticeable color. With my next example, I started out using circular motion, then I burned zigzags over the area. I'm using the edge of the shader for this, and the edge of the shader is really thin. This makes it very easy to sink down into the wood surface. Using a light hand pressure minimizes the sinking, so I can add more layers of circular motion and zigzags over the area. As I repeat the burn strokes using a heavy hand pressure, you again see that the color fades quickly. A bigger problem is how deep the nib sinks down into the wood surface. Layering gets a lot more difficult, especially adding more zigzag layers. The deep burn lines trap the nib, making it hard to add new lines. With my last example, I'm burning just zigzags. This is my preferred burn stroke for short fur and tree bark texture. It requires a number of layers to achieve the proper look. Using a light hand pressure makes it possible to do this. When I use a heavy hand pressure, I run into problems. The nib sinks deeply into the wood surface. It is difficult to add more layers. Instead, the nib wants to follow in the channels of previous burn lines, making them even deeper and darker. It doesn't produce the look I'm after. Comparing the heavy hand pressure burns on the left with the light hand pressure burns on the right, You can easily see how hand pressure impacts the burn results. The lines on the left are much deeper than those on the right. To test your hand pressure, write your name or a short sentence on a piece of paper, preferably with a couple of pieces of paper under it to cushion your writing. Then erase what you wrote. Afterwards, gently coat the area with graphite using the side of a pencil. Next, lightly rub over that graphite with a clean paper towel to smooth out the pencil marks. Can you see what you wrote? If the answer is yes, then you are using a heavy hand pressure. Many of the words in the sentence that Todd wrote are easy to see, whereas it is difficult to see any of the words that I wrote. The pressure I used is ideal for pyrography. Tip 3 recap. Use a light hand pressure. This will give you smoother burn results, easier to get uniform color on the burns, easier to get consistent, repeatable burn strokes, the nib doesn't sink into the board surface, and it's easier to layer burn strokes. Tip 4. Use just enough heat. When you're first starting, the inclination is to crank that heat up and use way too high of a heat. The higher the heat is, the harder it is to control your burn results. Plus, you start running the risk of overburn and carbon buildup. So let's take a look. Notice how much smoke is being generated as I burn. The heat is set way too high. It's causing the nib to sink down into the wood surface, creating dark channels that are easy to see. Another thing you can easily see is the overburn that is being created. Overburn is when the wood adjacent to the area that you are burning darkens up. A red arrow is pointing to a spot. Burning at a high heat makes it very difficult to stay within the boundaries of smaller areas. I turned down the heat on my burner, and I am still able to get dark burn results. I do have to reburn over some areas a couple of times, but on the flip side, there isn't overburn, and the burn results are smooth. Also, it is much easier to stay within the boundaries of small areas. Here's a close-up of the burns created at high heat. They are not very smooth looking. Now let's look at the side that was done with a lower heat. Notice how much smoother those burn results are. My burner remains at the same heat level that I used on the left wing. This heat setting is still too high because it is difficult to get lighter colored burn results. I have to move my hand quickly to try to do so, but the minute I go back to a normal hand speed, the color gets darker. I've turned down the heat setting a bit on my burner, and the burn results are lighter in value. I have to reburn over areas to get a darker color. This allows more control over the final tonal value. Once again, I have reduced the heat on my burner. Now it is much easier to get lighter colored burn results. My basic philosophy is that the slower you need to work, the lower the heat setting should be. These small markings on the wings are a great example of when it is good to work slow. With each marking, I reduced the heat a little bit more on my burner. On the last marking, I finally got the perfect heat setting because I could get a tan color while working slowly. If I want the color to be darker, all I have to do is reburn. I'm starting out with a nice clean nib. The heat setting on my burner is really low. I can burn for a very long time, and I doubt the pen tip will ever have carbon buildup on it. Looking at a close-up of the nib reveals it is still very clean. I increased the heat on my burner, and now I'm reburning over the area. Since the heat is still on the lower side, I don't have to worry about overburn or carbon buildup. Looking at a close-up of the nib reveals that it is still very clean. I've turned up the heat on my burner, and now we can start to see little wisps of smoke being generated, and the burn results are darker. Despite this, to get a darker result means I have to reburn. To get even darker results, I have to slow down my hand speed. If you slow down your hand speed enough, you can get really dark results with a low heat setting. I generally lack the patience for this unless it's for a very short time. The nib is still clean. I increase the heat some more on my burner and more smoke is visible. Plus there is some slight overburn above the area I'm burning on. At this temperature, I will eventually get some carbon buildup on the nib. Since I didn't burn for very long, the nib remains clean. The heat on my burner has been increased significantly. Even though I only did 4 short burn strokes, the nib already has some carbon buildup. Carbon buildup acts as an insulator. That blocks some of the nib heat from reaching the wood. This reduces the darkness of the burn results. Often, artists increase the heat setting on the burner to compensate for this. Then more carbon builds up, the heat gets increased some more, etc. All of this can be avoided by using just enough heat to achieve the color that you want. Burning at high heat can create a thin layer of carbon residue on boards. If you rub a clean Q-tip over the board, it can pick up some of that carbon. The problem with this is that bits of that carbon residue can dislodge if you brush over them, becoming embedded in whatever medium you're using. Tip 4 recap: use just enough heat. This way you can work in a slower, more controlled fashion. You can achieve a wider range of tonal values. The surface texture of the burn results are smoother, nibs stay clean longer, lower heats reduces overburn, it reduces carbon buildup and carbon residue. The slower you need to work, the lower the heat should be. Tip 5. Use a minimal number of nibs. The reason for this is that you will learn how to position those nibs, what their working temperature is. You will get very familiar with those nibs, so you spend more time burning instead of figuring out the machine. Now there are a lot of nibs available, so let me show you some of my recommendations. My first recommendation is a writer nib. Every brand of burner has one. If you use solid brass nibs, I would recommend one that looks like this one. Writer nibs can do a variety of things, such as lines, dots, etc. Writer nibs are ideal for burning in tiny to small spaces. You can use them in medium-sized spaces, but it is generally faster to use a shader nib instead. I do have a tutorial that shows how to create artwork using just a writer nib. This Easter chick is that artwork, and a link to the tutorial will be in the video description. For a shader, I recommend Colwood's D shader if you have a Colwood burner. The different sides on the shader allow for a variety of burn widths to be achieved. This shader is a good choice for medium to large sized areas. If you are really careful, you can use it in small areas, but I think a writer nib would be better for that. If you have an Optima burner, I recommend their spear shader. A variety of burn widths can be created with it. The point allows for burning in small areas with ease. This shader is good for small to large areas. Keep in mind that this is the only shader of Optima's I own, so there could be better options. I would recommend checking out their website or checking with other YouTube pyrography channels to see if they have any recommendations. With Burnmaster, I'd recommend either their 2B shader or their 11A spear shader. The 2B shader is a bit more limited on the variety of burn widths. Burning in small areas requires very careful positioning of the nib. I would say that this nib is good for medium to large size spaces. Burnmaster Spear Shader can create a wide variety of burn widths. It is fairly easy to burn in small areas using just the tip of the shader. That said, I think it is much easier to use the shader in larger areas. What I don't like about the spear shader is how long the nib is. I have to be careful and use just the front end of the nib. If I let the entire nib come in contact with the board, the back end of the nib would burn past the boundaries of the marking I'm burning in. I seldom use this nib, so I'm sure with practice it would be easier to use. I would say that this nib is good for small to large areas. A lot of burners, like Razertip, use unmounted wire nibs. You can get a set like this one for under $15 on Amazon. The nib I would recommend is this V-shaped nib. It is possible to create an assortment of burn widths. Burning in small areas requires careful angling of the nib. I think a rider nib would be a better choice for that. This nib is much easier to use in bigger areas. In fact, this nib is one that I will use for large background work. I would say that this nib is good for medium to large areas. I very seldom use brass nibs, so I don't have a lot of experience with them. I know this universal nib is the preferred preference of Minisa with Wood Burning University. She has created amazing artwork using this nib. She has a tutorial that explains how to use it, and I'll put a link in the video description. I lean more towards the chisel tips, the angled rounds, and the calligraphy tips. Truth be told, I'm not good at using any of them. As I said before, I lack experience with brass tips. If you want good information about brass tips, I would highly recommend checking with channels that actually use brass tips, channels like Minisa's. Tip 5 Recap. Use a minimal number of nibs so that you learn how to position the nib, what temperature works best with the nib. That level of familiarity allows you to concentrate on your artwork instead of the mechanics of your burner. I recommend a rider nib for tiny to small areas and a shader for medium to large areas. Now let's talk about recycling boards. Before you recycle a board, I highly recommend taking a picture of the artwork. This way you can document your progress you are making. I know for me personally, when I was first starting out, it was so frustrating. You see stuff on the internet and you're thinking, God, I wish my artwork looked like that. It's taking forever. I'm not making progress. I would go through and look at the pictures I had taken and see that I was making progress. I was improving. And this kept me motivated to stick with pyrography, and I think you will find the same to be true. Now, let me show you how to recycle a board. I have this piece of basswood that was too small for the artwork I was wanting to create. Since I was going to recycle the board, I used the backside to practice textures on. To recycle a board, simply sand off the existing artwork. Todd is using 100 grit sandpaper for this. Depending on how deep and/or how dark the burns are, it will be faster to use a power sander. Because this is a solid wood board, it can be recycled numerous times. Most likely, by the time the board gets too thin for further recycling, your artwork will have improved to the point where you don't need to recycle the board anymore. This image shows a side view of plywood and basswood. The basswood is solid. whereas the plywood is made of layers. You cannot recycle plywood. The burnable top layer of plywood is very thin. It will get sanded off and the underlying glue layer exposed, which is not safe to burn on. Again, I want to emphasize you cannot recycle plywood. The top burnable layer on plywood is super thin. When you sand away your artwork, you're probably going to sand off that top layer and you'll be in the glue layer that's underneath. And that is not safe to burn on. Your health is not worth that risk. Well, that is it for this video. I hope the information was helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.